June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. First light. A pale gray horizon hangs over the channel, blurred by mist and the rising smoke of naval shells. The tide rolls in cold and fast, pushing against the ramps of the assault craft as they lurch toward the sand. For the men inside, the world is nothing but the thrum of engines, the metallic rattle of equipment, and the growing sound of machine guns working somewhere ahead, steady, confident, unbroken. When the ramps drop, the first rows vanish into sheets of fire. Bullets snap across the water, striking packs, helmets, and bodies before they reach the surf. Mortar bursts throw columns of spray into the air. Everything about the landscape seems designed to pin them down. The steep bluffs, the narrow draws, the dark silhouettes of German positions carved into the heights. From above, it looks impossible. For the defenders, it was supposed to be. Yet beneath the chaos, something else is forming. Small movements, scattered choices, quiet moments of resolve that will soon reshape what the Germans believed unbreakable. And to understand how those expectations were built, we must look at the world that produced this battlefield.
To understand why Omaha became the deadliest of all the D-Day beaches, we must begin with its geography. Long before the first landing craft touched the surf, the shoreline revealed its character, a crescent of pale sand pressed beneath steep, broken bluffs rising more than 100 feet. At first glance, it appeared simply rugged, but to German engineers, it was a gift, terrain that could be turned into a fortress with minimal effort. After 1940, as German control spread across the French coast, the cliffs of Omaha drew immediate interest. They formed a natural wall overlooking a narrow strip of beach no more than a few hundred yards deep at low tide. Above that strip lay a series of deep draws, small valleys that cut through the bluffs and provided the only viable exits for vehicles. Whoever held the high ground controlled everything below it. And in war, anything that funnels men into predictable paths becomes a killing zone. By 1943, as Allied planning for a cross-channel invasion accelerated, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was tasked with tightening the coastal defenses. He traveled from Denmark to the Bay of Biscay, studying beaches, soil, tides, and the shape of every inlet. When he reached the Normandy sector, he immediately grasped the significance of Omaha. The beach could not be bypassed. Its position divided the American and British landing zones. Whoever held it would link the Allied front. Whoever failed would create a dangerous gap. Rommel pushed for speed and ruthlessness. Under his direction, German units built concrete gun casements, trench networks, minefields, and mortar pits along the heights. Log obstacles, steel hedgehogs, teller mines, and underwater charges were placed along the tide line, designed not only to destroy landing craft, but to slow the infantry long enough for machine gun crews to cut them down. Every bluff received multiple firing points. Every draw was choked with barbed wire and reinforced positions. The interlocking fields of fire meant that no part of the beach was safe. At the heart of these defenses stood the 352nd Infantry Division, a well-trained formation transferred to Normandy earlier than Allied intelligence realized. Analysts believed Omaha would be defended primarily by static coastal units, older soldiers with less mobility and fewer heavy weapons. In reality, the 352nd brought battle experience, discipline, and an aggressive approach to countering amphibious assaults. Their officers drilled them continually, rehearsing how to concentrate fire on the first waves before heavier Allied support could arrive. By late May 1944, German confidence was high. They knew an invasion was coming, but not where or when. The bluffs of Omaha became their insurance policy, a terrain advantage amplified by fortification and expectation. Even if the Allies landed there, the Germans believed the attackers would be trapped on the sand, unable to scale the heights under fire. Across the channel, Allied planners understood the risks but had no better option. Omaha was essential. It joined the sectors of two American divisions, the seasoned 1st Infantry Division and the newly arrived 29th Infantry Division. The landing there would anchor the U.S. right flank and enable a drive inland toward St. Lo. Without Omaha, the entire Normandy plan risked collapse. Still, planners misjudged the strength of the opposition. Aerial reconnaissance and resistance reports confirmed fortifications, but the presence of the 352nd went unnoticed. The pre-landing bombardment would target known positions, but many guns were too well concealed or too distant for naval fire to neutralize completely. In briefings, commanders warned their men that Omaha would be difficult. Few imagined how steep the odds would become. As dawn approached on June 6th, the German defenses along the bluffs stood ready, manned, supplied, and perfectly positioned, watching the gray horizon for movement. The terrain they trusted, the fortifications they had built, and the division they believed capable of repelling any assault, all waited for the test they had spent months preparing to meet. Yet on the opposite shore, American infantry were preparing for a different test, one shaped by training, uncertainty, and incomplete intelligence. Their expectations would collide with the brutal reality of the bluffs, and that story begins with the men who were sent to take them. On the American side, preparation for Omaha stretched back months, but no amount of rehearsal could replicate the exact battlefield they were about to enter. The responsibility for taking the beach fell to the 1st Infantry Division, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, and the 29th Infantry Division, a National Guard formation experiencing its first major combat operation. Their training emphasized amphibious landings, coordination with engineers, and rapid movement inland. Every man understood the plan: clear the shingle, push toward the draws, and secure the exits before German reinforcements could react. Yet these exercises took place on gentle English beaches, not beneath cliffs carved by erosion and fortified by German labor battalions. Even in the final briefings, many officers believed they would face mostly static coastal troops. The intelligence picture had lagged behind reality. Photos showed casements and trenches, but the presence of the 352nd Infantry Division, fresh, mobile, and aggressive, remained unknown to the attacking force. Only a few analysts suspected something was different. Their warnings, buried under conflicting reports, would only be understood in hindsight. In the days before the assault, weather became the greatest enemy. High winds and rough seas threatened to postpone the landings, and for a moment the fate of Operation Overlord hung on the judgment of a handful of meteorologists. When the final decision was made to proceed on June 6th, commanders knew the rough seas would scatter the landing craft and disrupt precision. But they also knew delay carried equal risk. German defenses were strengthening each week. American troops boarded their transports under a sky clogged with low clouds, rain, and rolling waves. Many grew seasick long before reaching the rendezvous points. Tanks intended to provide direct fire support were equipped with canvas flotation screens designed to let them swim ashore under their own power. But in the heavy surf, most sank before reaching the beach, depriving infantry of vital early support. The pre-landing bombardment, intended to weaken German positions, failed to deliver decisive results. Bombers dropped their loads too far inland, unwilling to risk friendly fire in the low visibility. Naval guns struck where they could, but many German emplacements had been reinforced with steel, concrete, and deep earth and cover. When the smoke settled, most machine gun nests and mortars remained fully operational, waiting for the landing craft to appear through the haze. As H hour approached, American commanders still held to the central assumption: the first waves would punch through the beach obstacles, secure a foothold, and move rapidly toward the bluffs. Engineers would open lanes through the minefields. Infantry would follow behind them. Armor would push up the draws. The plan depended on speed, coordination, and a manageable level of resistance. What they encountered instead was a battlefield shaped by unpredictability.
Strong currents dragged landing craft eastward, scattering companies and mixing units from both divisions. Some assault teams landed in deeper water than expected, forcing men to wade under fire with full gear, theirs or their comrades'. Radios became waterlogged. Mortar rounds struck before ramps opened. Entire platoons disappeared within seconds of landfall. Officers tried to restore order, but command structures began collapsing almost immediately. Men from different companies and even different regiments found themselves fighting side by side. On some parts of the beach, the casualties were so severe that leadership fell to corporals and privateers who had never planned to guide anyone beyond their own squad. Yet even in this chaos, a pattern was emerging. Small knots of infantry refusing to lie still under the bluffs, inching forward despite the fire pouring down on them. Their movements were uncoordinated, improvised, and often born from desperation rather than design. But they were happening everywhere, up and down the beach, from veterans of the 1st Division to the young men of the 29th. The Germans believed the bluffs would hold because no army could advance under such concentrated fire. The Americans were discovering that centralized plans were collapsing, but individual initiative was taking its place. The struggle at Omaha cannot be understood through a single lens. It was shaped by the ground itself, the movements of scattered infantry, the weather that distorted every plan, and the mindset of the defenders who trusted the bluffs to do most of the work. Everything that happened on the beach that morning was the result of forces colliding at once, each influencing the other in ways no commander fully anticipated. The tactical reality was unforgiving. The beach was long and exposed, with almost no natural cover. German positions were placed not to fire straight out to sea, but along the length of the sand. This meant that any group of Americans moving forward would be struck from multiple angles at once. Mortar crews fired from behind the crest, dropping shells into places where the infantry instinctively gathered, around obstacles, behind burned-out landing craft, or near the shingle where the surviving men concentrated. The draws leading inland were narrow and deeply fortified, turning every step toward them into a gamble. What the Americans faced was a battlefield engineered to punish movement, a landscape where every tactical advantage lay with the defenders. Yet combat on Omaha was not decided solely by tactics written on maps. It was shaped just as much by the human reactions taking place minute by minute across the sand. Once the landing craft touched shore, most soldiers found themselves separated from their units, sometimes by hundreds of meters. Training dissolved into instinct. Small groups formed wherever men could gather, behind obstacles, in shallow depressions, in the lee of shattered equipment. Leadership emerged from whoever remained standing. Sergeants pushed forward first, sometimes without knowing who followed. Privates identified small gaps in the enemy's fire and signaled others to move with them. These were moments made not through sweeping commands, but through decisions taken with no time, no certainty, and no guarantee of survival. The slow forward creep of dozens of tiny groups, unknown to one another, yet acting with the same desperation, began loosening the grip of the bluffs. The environment shaped the battle as powerfully as any weapon. The heavy surf scattered landing craft and pushed units far from their assigned sectors. Because of this drift, some companies faced the strongest German strongpoints, while others landed in areas where the fire was less intense. Smoke from burning obstacles mixed with sea haze, sometimes hiding machine gun nests, sometimes revealing them. The tide added its own pressure. As water rose, the narrow strip of sand shrank, trapping men closer to the base of the bluffs. Mines that engineers hoped to clear earlier became submerged, creating new pockets of danger with every retreating step. Even the soil along the cliffs played a role. In places, it crumbled under boots, offering handholds or small routes upward that no map had marked. In other places, it collapsed beneath weight, turning attempted climbs into hazardous slides back toward the kill zones. From the German vantage point, the battle initially appeared to unfold exactly as expected. Their opening fire tore through the first waves with devastating precision. Machine gunners shifted targets from left to right, maintaining continuous fire across the sand. Mortar crews adjusted elevation and range as new groups appeared. On the heights, the defenders saw chaos below: burning craft, bodies floating in the surf, men pressed flat against the shingle, and believed the assault was breaking as planned. The Atlantic Wall had been built on the assumption that an amphibious attack could be destroyed in its opening moments, and for nearly an hour, everything happening on Omaha seemed to confirm this idea. But this confidence contained its own weakness. German doctrine emphasized holding fixed positions until inland counterattacks could be organized. The defenders on the bluffs rarely left their posts, even when small American movements threatened the edges of their fields of fire. They were not equipped to maneuver down the slopes to seal these gaps quickly. What they saw from above looked like scattered survivors with no ability to mount a coordinated advance. What they could not see was the cumulative effect of dozens of individual attempts at movement. One crater crossed, one stretch of sand sprinted, one machine gun nest silenced by a handful of determined soldiers. By mid-morning, the German position still held, but subtle changes were forming across the beach. The Americans had not broken through. They had not scaled the bluffs in force, but they had begun to move, and movement, any movement, was the first threat to the German assumption that the terrain alone would hold the line. Those changes, still fragile and isolated, would deepen as leadership, technology, and sheer momentum began shifting the battle toward a direction neither side had fully predicted.
As the morning wore on, the battle at Omaha began to change character. The chaos of the first hour slowly gave way to a pattern, one shaped not by grand strategy, but by the smallest decisions taken under relentless fire. What had begun as survival was becoming something more structured, driven by leadership that surfaced from every rank, and by tools that, once brought into position, could finally challenge the dominance of the bluffs. Much of the shift came from officers who found themselves leading fragments of units they had never trained with. Captains who expected to command companies now led handfuls of men. Lieutenants who landed without radios improvised signals with hand motions or shouts lost in the wind. Even non-commissioned officers assumed command when necessary, pushing groups forward through dunes and pockets of dead ground, using every fold of terrain as a shield. What mattered was not the official chain of command, but the willingness of individuals to act. Movement began in inches, crawling, sliding, rushing short distances between bursts of fire. Slowly, across the beach, the infantry rediscovered momentum. Weapons that had been scattered in the surf or dropped by fallen soldiers were gathered and redistributed. Light machine guns were set up behind chunks of obstacles and burned-out craft. Rifles were aimed at the narrow openings of bunkers, forcing German gunners to duck back between volleys. In certain pockets, bazooka teams crawled forward to engage concrete emplacements that had seemed invulnerable an hour earlier. Engineers, many of whom had suffered catastrophic losses in the initial landings, continued working through exhaustion to blow gaps in the wire. Each opening they created allowed small groups to slip closer to the base of the bluffs, where the angle of fire diminished and the first real opportunities for ascent appeared. Naval gunfire added another layer of change. At first, ships offshore had struggled to target German strongpoints, hidden by smoke and the natural contours of the cliffs. But as spotters on the beach redirected fire, or as naval officers made bold decisions to lower their guns dangerously close to friendly lines, the accuracy improved. Shells began landing atop the bluffs, bursting among mortar teams and shaking the confidence of machine gunners who had previously fired with impunity. Even if the positions survived, the shock forced temporary pauses in firing. These moments, brief as they were, gave the Americans the slivers of time they needed to move. Psychology played its own subtle, powerful role. For the Germans, the belief in the bluff's invincibility had been a central assumption. The Atlantic Wall at Omaha was not designed merely to slow an enemy, It was designed to destroy the first waves entirely. When scattered groups of Americans continued to advance despite overwhelming fire, it introduced a level of uncertainty that had not been accounted for. The defenders still held the heights, still controlled the exits, and still maintained overlapping fields of fire, yet the view from above was beginning to shift. Instead of seeing isolated survivors pinned helplessly, German soldiers now saw clusters of movement, small, disorganized, but undeniably persistent, pushing toward the shoulders of the draws. The psychological barrier that had defined the battlefield was beginning to crack. For the Americans, the psychological equation ran in the opposite direction. Everything had gone wrong at the start. Scattered landings, lost equipment, drowned armor, shattered units. But each yard gained by one group was visible to others nearby. Men who believed the beach was a dead end now saw soldiers edging up gullies or slipping behind rocks at the base of the cliffs. The idea that the bluffs could be reached and then climbed spread like a spark. It was not spoken. It moved through eye contact, gestures, and the simple fact that someone, anyone, was still going forward. Momentum is not always obvious in its earliest moments. It can look like a single machine gun nest silenced by a grenade. It can be a group of 10 finding cover behind a fold of earth. It can be naval shells landing close enough to shake dust from German firing slits. But when these moments accumulate, when they begin shaping each other, they become impossible to ignore. Across Omaha, that accumulation was underway. By late morning, the beach had ceased to be a place where survival alone dictated movement. It had become a platform from which the first real attempts to penetrate the German line were forming. Isolated climbs were beginning. The fire was shifting. The defenders were adjusting faster than planned, and the attackers were refusing to break. The bluffs had not yet been breached, but the conditions that would make a breakthrough possible were finally, unmistakably, taking shape. And soon, the decisive moments that would fracture the German defenses would arrive.
By late morning, the struggle at Omaha reached a point where the battle no longer resembled the chaotic landings of the early hours. It was becoming a contest measured not in yards, but in decisions, small, immediate, and made by men who understood that hesitation meant death. The first real cracks in the German defense appeared not with a dramatic charge or coordinated push, but through a series of scattered actions rising quietly across the beach. Near the center of Omaha, at the base of the bluffs overlooking the E1 draw, a cluster of infantry from multiple companies found themselves pinned behind the shingle. Machine gun fire streamed down from the heights, keeping heads low and rifles silent. Yet the steep slope above them, though exposed, offered something the beach did not: protection from enfilade fire. Inch by inch, small groups began crawling toward it, using patches of collapsed earth and smoke drifting from burning craft as concealment. No officer had ordered this movement. It emerged naturally, driven by necessity and by the simple fact that staying where they were meant eventual annihilation. Once the first handful of men reached the base of the slope, others followed. The Germans, confident in the interlocking fields of fire designed to cover the sand, found that these angles diminished sharply the moment attackers pressed close to the foot of the bluff. Machine guns that had swept the beach clean could not aim directly downward. Mortar crews struggled to drop shells on targets so close to the cliff. For the first time all morning, the Americans occupied ground where the German defenses did not fully overlap. Farther to the east, elements of the 1st Infantry Division made a similar discovery. A shallow gully, barely noticeable on reconnaissance photos, provided partial cover leading upward. It was not a planned route, not part of any assault diagram, but it offered just enough protection for movement. Soldiers slipped into it one by one, climbing steadily, sometimes stopping to fire back at silhouettes appearing briefly in the openings of German positions. The ascent was slow, punishing, and uncertain, yet it was upward, the one direction the Germans had been sure no force could advance under fire. Along the western sector, men from the 29th Infantry Division used the remains of an exploded obstacle as a starting point. Behind it, a small depression in the sand led toward a patch of tangled brush halfway up the bluff. Grenades were lobbed toward suspected firing positions. Smoke drifted across the slopes. Germans fired blindly at movement, but the attackers kept coming, scattering as they climbed, never bunching long enough for a single mortar to wipe them out. The impossible was beginning to look possible. Crucially, these efforts were not coordinated. No single officer saw all the advances at once. What tied them together was not communication, but timing. The trickle of men reaching the slopes occurred just as naval gunfire began striking the upper edges of the German defenses with greater precision. Destroyers, operating dangerously close to shore, fired direct shots into firing slits. Each impact shook dust and debris into the faces of German gunners who had spent the morning firing uninterrupted. Even if the positions held, the rhythm of their shooting faltered. This shift in momentum was subtle but unmistakable. German defenders who had begun the day with confidence bordering on certainty now found movement appearing at the edges of their vision, shapes crawling where none should have survived. Reports coming in through field telephones mentioned isolated penetrations and enemy approaching slopes, language that hinted at concern but not yet panic. Still, it meant the Americans were no longer trapped below. Once a few groups reached halfway up the bluffs, the balance of the fight shifted sharply. From those new vantage points, they could fire into the shoulders of German positions, angles the defenders had not armored heavily. Grenades thrown upward forced gunners to abandon firing ports. Riflemen picked off silhouettes behind sandbags. Engineers carrying demolition charges crept toward the entrances of casements, risking everything to silence weapons that had dominated the beach for hours. No single action broke the defensive line, but each success fed the next. With every machine gun nest neutralized, the fire on the beach weakened slightly. With every weakened sector, more men found the courage to leave the shingle and climb. The Germans attempted to redirect fire, but the bluffs themselves betrayed them. What had been a perfect field of fire against the beach now fractured under the pressure of attackers approaching from multiple angles. By midday, the American presence on the bluffs was no longer just scattered remnants. It was becoming a continuous line, thin, fragile, and still exposed, but undeniably advancing. The defenders sensed the difference immediately. What had been an unstoppable barrage from above was now a contested struggle at close quarters. Machine gunners who had spent the morning firing downward found themselves fighting on their own level, exchanging rifle shots across the rocky ground. The bluffs themselves, once the Germans' greatest weapon, were turning into the battleground where their assumptions would collapse.
The decisive moment, the one that would truly fracture their line and end the belief that Omaha could be held, was about to unfold. The tipping point came slowly at first, then all at once. By early afternoon, the American climb up the bluffs had reached a stage where isolated advances began merging into something far more dangerous to the German line, a continuous rising presence of infantry pushing toward the crest. For the first time since dawn, the defenders could no longer treat the fight as a matter of controlling the beach. The battle had shifted upward onto the very ground they believed would secure victory. Near the center of the sector, one group of infantry reached the top of the bluff by following a narrow fold in the terrain. Their arrival was not dramatic. There was no charge, no coordinated assault, just a handful of exhausted men emerging over the lip of the slope, surprised to be alive. They were met by scattered German fire, but their sudden appearance forced nearby defenders to reposition. With their fields of fire redirected toward the crest, their influence over the beach below weakened. This subtle shift opened space for more Americans to climb, transforming a single breakthrough into a widening trail of movement. Moments later, on the eastern heights, engineers carrying satchel charges approached a fortified position that had dominated a large stretch of beach since dawn. They had crawled, sprinted, and paused their way up the slope for over an hour,
working behind every scrap of cover the cliff offered. When they reached the casement entrance, they acted with the urgency of men who understood what depended on them. The explosion that followed shook dust and smoke into the air, silencing the weapon that had pinned hundreds of men for most of the morning. Its loss created a noticeable vacuum in the German firing pattern. Whole swaths of sand that had been swept by uninterrupted fire suddenly fell quiet. Further west, near the Vierville Draw, a group of soldiers found an unguarded lane between two firing positions. The gap existed not because the Germans had made a mistake, but because their doctrine assumed no enemy would ever reach such a position. When American infantry slipped through it, the defenders on either side were forced to divide their attention, creating confusion along a defensive system that relied on absolute cohesion. A single gap in an interlocking line of fire weakened everything around it. Communications among German units deteriorated rapidly. Runners who attempted to move between positions encountered unexpected American fire. Telephones connecting bunkers and command posts crackled with incomplete reports. Officers trying to form a coherent picture of the battlefield received fragments at best. Mentions of attackers scaling the slopes, positions going silent, and movements appearing behind the first line of defense. The rigid doctrine that had required each unit to hold its position now left them unable to respond quickly to breaches forming on multiple points of the bluffs. On the beach below, the change was unmistakable. Men who had spent hours pinned beneath unbroken fire now saw rifle flashes from friendly soldiers near the crest. They recognized the shift in intensity. Fire that had swept horizontally along the sand began breaking up as German gunners were forced to defend themselves from above. The psychological weight of the bluffs, which had crushed American confidence early in the morning, began to lift. Infantry who had remained motionless for fear of instant death now found space, small but real, to move forward again. With every additional climb, the situation for the defenders worsened. They had built their system around preventing an ascent. Once the Americans were above the beach, the defenses were no longer a fortress, but a maze of isolated positions vulnerable from angles never envisioned in their construction. Machine gun nests that had dominated the sea were exposed from the rear. Mortar teams, focused on the sand below, struggled to adapt to attackers closing in through gullies and brush. The Atlantic Wall was not collapsing, it was being peeled apart from the inside. By early afternoon, the inevitable became clear. American infantry reached the first roads and fields behind the bluffs, terrain that offered more cover and far more maneuverability than the beach. German units in the rear, unprepared for an assault from this direction, began withdrawing or attempting to form improvised defensive lines. The belief that Omaha could hold indefinitely, one of the central assumptions of German coastal strategy, was slipping away. Once the bluffs fell, the battle for the beach was effectively decided. The defenders who remained near the crest fought bitterly, but they no longer controlled the ground that made their positions formidable. The attackers who had begun the day scattered and disorganized were now moving inland in growing numbers, connecting, reorganizing, and driving toward the objectives that hours earlier had seemed unreachable. The moment the Americans reached firm ground above the beach, Omaha was no longer a question of survival. It was a foothold, fragile, costly, and bought with staggering effort, but a foothold that would expand into the broader campaign for Normandy. And as the fighting eased along the shoreline, a new reality settled across the battlefield. The bluffs Germany expected to hold had fallen, and the consequences of that breakthrough were only beginning to unfold.
By late afternoon, the violence that had defined the first hours in Omaha began to settle into a different rhythm. The beach was still chaotic, littered with wrecked landing craft, burning debris, medical teams moving through the sand. But the thunder of unbroken machine gun fire had faded. The long, punishing lines of tracer that had swept the shoreline all morning were now intermittent, scattered, and uncertain. The German positions that once dominated the bluffs were silent or abandoned, their firing ports dark, their communication lines severed. For the first time since dawn, the beach belonged to the Americans. Engineers pushed forward quickly, clearing mines from the draws and widening paths for vehicles. The difficulty of the terrain remained, but the threat that had turned every step into a gamble was gone. Bulldozers rolled off newly arrived landing craft and began carving lanes through the shingle and up the lower slopes, creating avenues for tanks, jeeps, and supply trucks. What had been impossible that morning, heavy equipment reaching the top of the bluffs, was now a matter of time and labor. The transformation from killing ground to staging area had begun. Medics confronted the true cost of the breakthrough. Casualties lined the sand in long, somber rows. Some men who had crawled forward during the early hours were now carried back on stretchers, their uniforms torn and darkened, their faces drained by exhaustion and shock. Others sat silently near the seawall, staring out at the water, the noise of battle replaced by the murmurs of waves rolling in. The psychological toll was visible everywhere. Soldiers who had believed they would never leave the beach now stood in small groups, talking quietly, replaying moments of survival that still felt unreal. Higher up the slopes, American units that had breached the bluffs began reorganizing. What had started as scattered fragments of companies was now taking shape into coherent lines. Officers distributed ammunition, confirmed identities, and re-established leadership structures broken during the landings. The disarray of the morning was being replaced by the steady, disciplined form of a force preparing for its next mission, pushing inland before German reinforcements could mount a counterattack. From the German perspective, the aftermath was defined by shock. Reports filtering back through surviving command posts described events that defied expectation. The beach that had been fortified for years, the bluffs that had been considered unassailable, the firing positions that had dominated the coast, all had fallen within a single day. Many officers believed the Americans must have landed far more troops than expected. Others attributed the breakthrough to naval firepower they had underestimated. Few understood that the collapse began not from overwhelming force, but from small groups of infantry refusing to remain pinned. By evening, the battle's outcome was beyond doubt. American troops held the high ground. The draws were opening. Supplies were flowing. The beachhead, once in danger of failing entirely, was secure enough for generals offshore to begin discussing the next phase of the Normandy campaign. The question was no longer whether Omaha could be held. It was how fast the Americans could move inland and link up with the forces at Utah and Gold. Yet the true weight of the victory was something the survivors could feel even before night fell. The sense of impossibility that had hung over the beach that morning had been replaced by a quiet, heavy understanding of what it had taken to climb those bluffs. The ground that stretched behind them, open fields, hedgerows, and distant villages, was the next battleground, but the one they had just won would remain etched into memory long after the fighting moved on. The strategic meaning of this breakthrough and the consequences it carried for the wider war were only beginning to reveal themselves.
As the sun lowered over the Normandy coastline and shadows stretched across the high ground above Omaha, the wider consequences of the day's struggle began taking shape. The breakthrough on the bluffs had done more than secure a foothold. It had rewritten the opening chapter of the largest amphibious invasion in history. What unfolded inland that evening would shape the tempo of the entire Normandy campaign. American units moving beyond the crest immediately encountered new terrain, rolling fields cut by hedgerows, farm lanes hemmed with earth banks, and scattered pockets of German resistance regrouping after the collapse of the coastal line. These defenders, shaken by the unexpected breach, attempted to form hasty blocking positions. But the Americans pressing forward were no longer the fragmented groups that had fought their way off the beach. They were reorganized, reinforced, and backed by a continuous flow of supplies now pouring ashore. Mortars, radios, and heavy weapons were coming up the draws. Tanks that had waited offshore for safe passage were beginning to roll across ground believed unreachable just hours earlier. In the German command network, confusion deepened.
Reports from Omaha contradicted everything senior officers had been led to expect. Some claimed the defenses were still intact. Others insisted the bluffs were lost and enemy forces were moving inland in strength. The delays in communication, the loss of forward observation posts, and the collapse of key firing positions made coordinated counterattacks nearly impossible. Divisions positioned inland were ordered to move toward the beachhead, but many were already stretched thin by Allied airborne landings and the chaos created across the broader front. Even those units capable of movement soon found themselves navigating congested roads, bombed bridges, and the growing threat of Allied aircraft sweeping the skies above Normandy. Strategically, the fall of Omaha sealed the fate of German defensive plans. The Atlantic Wall relied on the premise that the first waves of an invasion could be destroyed before a foothold formed. Once an attacker established control of the high ground and opened the exits, the fortifications lost their value. At Omaha, this shift happened within a single day, though at a staggering cost. German commanders who had dismissed the risk of a direct breakthrough now confronted the reality that fixed defenses, no matter how well placed, could not stop determined infantry once they gained room to maneuver. For the Allies, securing Omaha provided the missing link between the American landings at Utah and the British and Canadian sectors to the east. With the bluffs taken, the possibility of connecting these forces into a single broad front became achievable. It meant the beachhead would not be divided. It meant the armor and infantry needed for the push toward Saint-Lô, Caen, and eventually Paris could move inland with growing confidence. The success at Omaha, paired with breakthroughs across the other beaches, ensured that Operation Overlord would not stall on its first day. But the victory carried a weight that statistics alone could not express. Nearly every American unit that fought in Omaha suffered heavy casualties. Companies were reduced to platoons, platoons to squads, and yet the advance had continued. In the hours after the fighting, officers walked the grounds they had captured and understood the scale of what their men had faced. Reports written that night reflected a mixture of disbelief and grim pride. The beach that had nearly broken the invasion had been turned into a gateway. For many of the Germans who survived the day, the aftermath brought a different kind of reckoning. The belief that the bluffs could not be lost had shattered. The assumption that no enemy could withstand the concentrated fire of the positions above the beach proved false. Orders for withdrawal, consolidation, and new defensive lines underscored the realization that Normandy had entered a phase the Atlantic Wall was never designed to resist, a prolonged, mobile ground campaign. As darkness settled over the shore, the fires on the beach burned lower, and the tide washed quietly against the sand. The day's violence had reshaped both armies, one through loss, the other through the awakening of a momentum that would carry far beyond the cliffs. And in the stillness that followed, the meaning of Omaha, both immediate and enduring, began to take form. The broader significance of what happened there, the lesson carved into the bluffs themselves, would echo far beyond Normandy.
In the quiet hours after the fighting settled, Omaha became more than a battlefield. It became a measure of what determined soldiers can achieve when every advantage lies with the enemy. The bluffs that had towered over the first waves at dawn, symbols of inevitability and control, looked different in the fading light. They no longer represented a barrier. They represented the cost of breaking one. The German expectation that the terrain would hold had been reasonable. Every calculation favored the defenders: elevation, fortification, observation, prepared fire. In their view, the Atlantic Wall at Omaha was not simply a defensive line, it was a guarantee. But history rarely bends to certainty. It bends instead to persistence, to adaptability, to the willingness of individuals to push forward when every instinct warns them not to. The Americans who climbed those slopes did so not because the plan had survived contact with the enemy, but because they chose to keep moving long after the plan had fallen apart. Omaha became a study in the limits of engineering and the reach of human resolve. Static defenses, no matter how imposing,
cannot account for the countless small decisions made under fire. They cannot anticipate the moment when scattered soldiers begin acting with shared purpose, and they cannot stop an enemy who refuses to surrender the initiative. The breakthrough on Omaha's Bluffs reshaped the course of the war in Western Europe. It opened the path toward Normandy's interior, accelerated the collapse of German coastal strategy, and ensured that Operation Overlord would proceed with the momentum required to liberate France. Yet the legacy of that day rests not only in strategy or terrain, but in memory, borne quietly by those who survived and honored by the generations that followed. The beach that seemed destined to defeat them instead became the ground on which they proved what was possible. The bluffs the Germans believed unassailable stand today not as monuments to fortification, but as reminders of the moment when determination overcame the steepest odds. And in that transformation lies the enduring lesson of Omaha. Even the strongest defenses can break, but the resolve to climb, step by step, under fire, can endure far longer than any wall.